Hey, right, this has been a long time coming. For as long as I can remember, I mean, it must be 3, maybe 4 years. I've literally had, it must be 1,000 requests from Indian viewers on, various videos that I've made over those years for a review on the Honda CB350 Highness, which of course was something I wasn't able to do because, right since its inception, I'm not sure how many years ago it is now, it's not been available in the UK. And I've always thought that is a bit of a shame because, it's a lovely looking bike. Honda has a really rich motorcycle heritage here in the UK, and for that matter, worldwide. And in my motorcycling world, it really fits the bill. 350cc single-cylinder motorcycle. A modern classic motorcycle, very much like the bikes that were around in the 1970s in my sort of formative motorcycling years. But Honda obviously decided it wasn't worth bringing it over to Europe, or I don't know whether it was available in the US, I presume not, because of the Western motorcyclist fixation with larger multi-cylinder motorcycles. They obviously thought it just wouldn't sell, so, they didn't waste the time. Now, as I've been sort of saying for certainly the last 3 or 4 years, the motorcycle world is changing here, in the UK, Europe, and in the States. And what I describe as medium capacity motorcycles, I mean, other people might have different opinions on what constitutes that. I'm not going to argue with you. This is just the way I see it. Sort of 350cc to, 700cc's represent the sweet spot for motorcycling in the Western world, in most Western world countries. Price-wise, they don't break the bank to buy and run. And, they're just big enough to be able to compete on equal terms with most traffic on the roads. And this year's motorcycling sales figures have demonstrated that that is, in fact, the shift that people are making, with below 650cc motorcycle sales rising, while larger capacity motorcycle sales are falling. And it's not just sort of practicality and price, I don't think, that's driving this. I've always advocated that smaller bikes are much more satisfying, they're much more fun bikes to ride. There's no doubt that Royal Enfield have pioneered this shift in Western attitudes to smaller bikes. With a huge manufacturing capacity, they already had the security of their own domestic market. So it was a risk-free endeavour to export some of these bikes to other countries and see what happened. And the rest is history. The classic 350, the Hunter 350, the Meteor 350 and the Bullet 350 have sold to varying degrees, but they've sold well. That held the door open for, some of the Chinese brands that are now available, and the mighty Honda motorcycles have noticed. They've given the Honda CB350 Highness a slight makeover. They've renamed it the GB500s, and it's going to be available in the UK and Europe, certainly, for the 2025 season. And with Honda's reputation for build quality and performance, along with a price tag of just under £4,000, I don't see how it can fail. Now, you could argue that Honda are sort of copying from Royal Enfield here, and I would forgive you for doing that. But I think of it more in terms of, Honda have already been bitten by doing this in the past, and they've just been patient and they've sat back and waited to see what happens with these bikes from Royal Enfield, rather than jumping in feet first and repeating past mistakes. You see, the clue is in the name. They've changed it from the CB350 to the GB350. Now, that's reminiscent of a model that they introduced to the UK some 40 years ago that didn't do very well. But that's not all, because very recently they've registered the trademark for a model called the GB500 in the US and in Europe. It looks very much like the mighty Honda is about to take Royal Enfield on for a slice of the middleweight modern classic market, drawing on a piece of their own genuine heritage that, although still very relevant, is perhaps not very well known by most people. Now, it's funny how the human brain works, how memory works. You know, there's days when I have trouble remembering how old I am, but I remember with absolute crystal clarity 40 years ago sitting on a deck chair in the Yorkshire Dales at my mum and dad's caravan, taking a break from work for a few days, thumbing through a copy of one of the latest motorcycle magazines and coming across this, the Honda GB500 TT. For a 19-year-old lad who was just about to buy his first 550 multi-cylinder motorcycle, this seemed like a really strange concept. A modern classic. A brand new modern motorcycle designed from the ground up to look and feel like a classic British single-cylinder motorcycle from the 1960s. It was a cafe racer style bike with a single seat, no pillion accommodation, dual exhausts, with a power output of about 33 horsepower and a top speed reputed to be around about 108 miles per hour. I remember thinking at the time that it was a pretty bike that reminded me a lot of an AJS from the 1960s. It was a bike designed to appeal to the 40-something bikers returning to motorcycle after a 20-year hiatus, something that reminded them of the bikes that they'd grown up with and learned to ride on. It certainly wasn't a bike that I was interested in, but it sort of seemed to limp along sales-wise for about the next decade. I think it was introduced to the US market in about 1989, and then eventually faded into obscurity. But to my mind, certainly in hindsight, this was a historic motorcycle model. It was the first modern classic motorcycle. Honda were the first to do it. But unfortunately, the time wasn't right. Honda were about 2 decades ahead of the curve. Kawasaki tried the same feat about a decade later with the Kawasaki Zephyr 550 and 750. Both of which didn't stay in the Kawasaki lineup for long, and all motorcycle manufacturers more or less ignored the modern classic segment until Triumph tried again with the Bonneville with great success in the early 2000s. Now, this next bit is a little bit unclear, so it's a little bit sort of he said, she said, so I'm not going to try and unpick it on this video, but it's reputed that back in 2020 at the Japanese launch of the CB350, a journalist spotted in the exhibition that was there an example of a cutaway engine that was very much in the style of the CB350 engine, but when he took some quick measurements, he calculated that it was actually a 525cc motor. Now, I don't know whether it was air-cooled or liquid-cooled. I'm presuming air-cooled, but we don't know. But apparently, when he quizzed the event organisers about this 500 or 525cc engine, they denied that anything like that was in development. But when you add that occurrence to the recent registration of the GB500s trademark for the US and for Europe, it does look very much like we're going to get a GB500. Now, of course, traditionally, a modern classic has always been styled on a British motorcycle of the 1950s and 1960s. But let's be honest, most motorcyclists that rode those bikes back in the 1960s are either too old to ride now or they're no longer with us. So what I think we're looking at here is quite a shrewd shift by Honda to a range of modern classic motorcycles styled on their own models, much loved models from the 1970s. They're going to appeal to the next demographic in the modern classic story. In a very similar way to that we've seen with Yamaha, they're moving away from the 1950s and 1960s Brit bike classic to the archetypal 1970s Japanese modern classic. Something that arguably is going to be more appealing to the middle-aged rider of today. After all, we only go for the Royal Enfields and, you know, other makes of motorcycle that emulate British bikes from the 1960s because that's all that's really available to us. And maybe the time is now right for us to start looking at modern classics that are more familiar to, you know, the modern middle-aged rider, something that they saw or rode back in the 1970s when they were youngsters. There are, after all, some signs that the modern classic market is starting to contract a little bit. That's certainly the way that it's looked during 2024 sales, although that might just be an aberration. But if it is, I think Honda are going in exactly the right direction here. By bringing the modern classic a little bit more up to date, and in doing so making it more relevant to modern middle-aged riders. Let me know what you think in the comments section. Right, once again, thank you so much for supporting this channel by watching this and my other videos. I really do appreciate it. I would also appreciate it if you would leave a like and consider subscribing to this channel if you're not already a subscriber. There are other ways that you can help out via my Patreon page, PayPal donations, or via the super thanks button down below. Either way, it's much appreciated. I will of course be back next week, so until then, please ride safely and I'll see you soon.